My son called me on a Tuesday afternoon, and the first thing he said was, "Dad, I need you to skip Christmas this year." I remember exactly where I was, standing in my kitchen, reheating leftover chili, the kind of cold December afternoon where the radiator hisses and you feel grateful for small things. I had the phone pressed to my ear and I didn't say anything for a moment. I just stood there watching the steam rise from the pot. "What did you just say?" "It's not a big deal," my son said. He had that tone, the one he'd picked up sometime in the last 2 years, smooth and slightly impatient, like he was explaining something obvious to someone slow. "Natalie's family is flying in from Phoenix. It's a lot of people, a lot of dynamics. You know how it gets." I did not know how it gets. I'd been to his house for Christmas exactly once since he married Natalie, and that was the year before last. I'd sat at a table with her parents and her 2 sisters and her brother-in-law, who sold insurance and talked about golf, and I'd been perfectly fine. I'd brought a smoked brisket I'd made myself, the way my late wife used to make it every December with the dry rub that takes 2 days. Her mother had asked for the recipe. "Her family likes things a certain way," my son continued. "Low-key, relaxed, you know." "I'm not relaxed," I said. He exhaled. That exhale. "Dad, I'm asking a genuine question. It's just, Natalie gets anxious. You know she gets anxious." I knew that Natalie got anxious was something I'd been hearing for about 18 months, applied to an expanding list of situations. Natalie gets anxious when plans change last minute. Natalie gets anxious in crowded spaces. Natalie gets anxious about dietary things. Natalie got anxious, apparently, about my presence at my son's Christmas table. "Does Daniel know you're calling me?" I asked. A pause. It was a mutual decision, which meant no, or it meant yes, and my son was too uncomfortable to own it. Either way, I didn't push. I said I understood, told him to have a good holiday, and I hung up. Then I stood in my kitchen for a long time with the chili going cold again and thought about the fact that I had, at that moment, 41 years of memories of my son's face on Christmas morning. 41. Starting from when he was 3 days old. And we brought him home in a red stocking cap my wife had knitted because she'd read somewhere that newborns lose body heat fast. I turned off the stove. I wasn't hungry anymore. His name is Daniel. He's 34 years old. He works in commercial real estate in Atlanta, which is where I moved when I retired from 31 years as a civil engineer. I followed him there because his mother passed 8 years ago and I didn't want to rattle around our house in Columbus, Ohio alone. I sold the house. I bought a condo 12 minutes from his apartment, which later became 12 minutes from the townhouse he and Natalie bought together, which Natalie had picked out on her own and which my son had texted me pictures of rather than inviting me to see in person. I'm 63. I keep myself in reasonable shape. I walk 4 miles every morning. I cook real food. I read. I'm not what you'd call a difficult man. I paid for Daniel's college, all 4 years at Georgia Tech, plus the semester abroad in Berlin. I paid off the remainder of his student loans when he graduated because the interest rate was predatory and I had the money and he was my son. When he and Natalie got married 3 years ago, I gave them $40,000 as a wedding gift. Cash, because they said they didn't want a registry. They wanted to use the money toward the townhouse down payment. I did not get a thank you note. I got a text that said, "Dad, so generous, means everything, cry." And then nothing more. I want to be fair. Daniel is not a bad person. He's never been cruel or dishonest in any obvious way. What he became, somewhere between 32 and 34, was someone I didn't quite recognize. The edges of him changed. He started deferring to Natalie on everything, not in the way of a man who respects his partner, but in the way of a man who has forgotten he has his own opinions. He stopped calling on Sundays, which we'd done every week since his mother died. He started using phrases like, "Our priorities have shifted, and we're being more intentional about our circle." Our circle. I had known my son for 34 years. Apparently, I was outside the circle. I'd noticed Natalie's attitude toward me in small ways first. She had a way of looking just past me when I spoke, like I was a commercial she was waiting to end. She never asked me anything about my life, not about my work, not about my wife, not about anything. When I tried to tell a story at dinner, she would look at her phone or refill her wine glass, and when I finished, she'd say, and redirect to something else. She thought I was boring. She thought I was old. I could see it. What I didn't understand for a long time was how thoroughly she had convinced my son of the same thing. The Christmas call was the clearest moment. Up until then, I'd been making excuses, the way fathers do. He's busy. She's adjusting. Marriage is a new dynamic. Give it time. But when he told me to skip Christmas, and I heard underneath the smooth, impatient voice that he wasn't entirely sorry about it, something in me went quiet, not angry, just quiet. That night I made myself a real dinner, poured a glass of bourbon, and I thought about money. Specifically, I thought about the house. After I sold our place in Columbus, I didn't put all the proceeds into my condo. I bought a second property, a 4-bedroom colonial on 2 acres, about 25 minutes outside Atlanta, in a town called Roswell. Nice schools, good bones, mature trees in the backyard. I'd bought it as a rental for several years. But more honestly, I'd bought it because I imagined that one day Daniel and Natalie might have kids, and they might want more space. And it was the kind of house where children could grow up the way Daniel had grown up. The kind of house with a yard. I hadn't told Daniel the full picture of that house. He knew I had a rental property. He didn't know that I'd been maintaining it, keeping it in excellent condition, because I had always, quietly, privately, planned to give it to him. Not yet, but someday. It was in my estate plan, held in irrevocable trust. My attorney had drawn it up 4 years ago. Daniel was the sole beneficiary of that trust. I called my attorney, a woman named Patricia, the next morning. I asked her what it would take to change the trust. "Remove Daniel entirely?" she asked. "Not necessarily," I said. "I want to understand my options." We met in her office 2 days later. It was a Thursday, cold, the kind of Atlanta cold that feels apologetic compared to Ohio, but still gets in your bones if you don't dress for it. Patricia had coffee ready, and she walked me through everything without judgment, the way good attorneys do. We talked for 90 minutes. By the time I left, I had a clear picture of what was possible and what was mine to decide. I didn't change anything that day. I went home and I sat with it for a week. That week, Daniel texted me twice. Once to ask if I still had Mom's grandmother's recipe box because Natalie wanted to try making pierogi, and once to send me a link to a YouTube video about pickleball that he thought I'd like. No mention of the Christmas call. No acknowledgement. Just onward. The recipe box. I stared at that text for a long time. My wife Carol had kept her grandmother's recipe box for 40 years. Handwritten index cards, some of them so old the ink had faded to brown. Pierogi, yes, but also her mother's stuffed cabbage, her aunt's poppy seed roll, Christmas cookie recipes with notes in the margins, in 2 different handwritings, grandmother and granddaughter, trading tips across decades. Carol had carried that box from her childhood home in Pittsburgh to our apartment in Columbus to every house we ever lived in. She'd made recipes from it every Christmas Eve. When she got sick, she'd started teaching Daniel some of them, hoping to pass them down. He wanted it so Natalie could try making pierogi. I wrote back, "I'll look for it." And I set the phone face down on the counter. Christmas came. I spent it with my neighbor Harold, who is 71 and widowed and makes exceptional cornbread. We watched football and ate ham, and it was genuinely fine. I was not sitting at home feeling sorry for myself. I had decided, somewhere in that quiet week after the phone call, that I was done performing sadness for an audience that wasn't watching anyway. In January, I called Patricia again. The Roswell house had been appraised the previous spring at $12,000. The rental market was strong. I'd had good tenants for 2 years, but I had an offer from a developer who'd been interested for 18 months, a man named Gary, who wanted the land more than the house and had been circling patiently. He'd offered $690 in the spring. I called him in January and said I was ready to talk. We settled at $705,000. Closing was set for March 15th. I did not tell Daniel. I want to explain why, because I know how this sounds. It sounds withholding. It sounds like punishment. But here's the truth. That house was mine. I had bought it with money I earned over 31 years of getting up at 5 in the morning and putting on a hard hat and solving problems that other people found unsolvable. I had maintained it and paid taxes on it and made decisions about it. I had placed it in a trust as a gift, an entirely voluntary gift for a son I loved. The moment I decided it was no longer going to be that gift, it went back to being what it had always been, mine. I didn't owe Daniel an explanation for what I did with my own property, but I'll admit there was something else. I wanted to see what happened when the assumption was removed. I wanted to know what my son thought of me when he wasn't thinking about what he might eventually get from me. March was quiet. The closing went smoothly. I had just over $700,000 land in an account I'd had since before Daniel was born. I updated my estate documents with Patricia. I set up a charitable remainder trust for a portion of it, naming a scholarship fund at Ohio State in Carol's memory. She'd been the first in her family to get a degree, and she'd been proud of that her whole life. I revised my will. I felt, for the first time in a long while, like a man in charge of his own story. Daniel called me on a Saturday in April. "Hey, Dad." He sounded different, a little careful. "So, random question, but you know the Roswell house?" "Sure. I was looking at some property stuff and I saw it's been transferred out of the trust, like a deed transfer. I have a buddy at a title company, he mentioned it." "Yeah," I said. "I sold it." Silence. "You what? Sold it?" Silence. "You what? Sold it?" "Back in March. Good price, good timing. You sold the Roswell house." "That's right. Dad." His voice changed, went from careful to something tighter. "That was, I always assumed that was going to be, we talked about that house." "When did we talk about it?" I said. And I kept my voice even, because I was genuinely curious what he would say. Another silence. Longer this time. I thought it was part of the plan. Moms, I thought." He stopped. "Does Natalie know?" I almost laughed at that. Not at my son. At the question. At the reflex, even in that moment, to check what Natalie knew before figuring out how he himself felt. "I assume she knows now," I said. "Since you do, why didn't you tell me you were selling it? Why didn't you tell me you were canceling Christmas?" Dead silence. And here's the thing about that silence. It wasn't an angry silence. It was a realizing silence. I could almost hear the shape of the thought forming on the other end of the line. The slow, uncomfortable recognition that these things were connected. That actions have a logic. That a man who is told he is inconvenient does not remain indefinitely generous. "Dad," he said finally. His voice was different again, quieter. "Is this because of Christmas?" "It's because I made a business decision about my own property," I said. But I'd be lying if I said the last 2 years haven't been on my mind. He didn't have a ready answer for that. I heard him breathe. I heard what might have been him walking to another room, putting some distance between himself and wherever Natalie was. "I didn't handle Christmas right," he said. "No, you didn't." He started and stopped. "Daniel," I said. I don't need you to explain her. I need you to explain you." That landed. I could tell because of what came next, which was a long pause and then a sound that I hadn't heard from my son in years. A kind of exhale that wasn't impatience or deflection. There was something closer to the sound he used to make when he was a teenager, and something had genuinely gotten through to him. Something cracking open just slightly. "I don't know when I stopped calling on Sundays," he said. "August, 3 years ago, right after the wedding." He was quiet for a moment. "You kept track?" "I kept track because it mattered to me," I said. "The same way the recipe box mattered. The same way showing up for Christmas matters. You know what your mother would say." He knew. He'd always known. Carol had a saying that she deployed sparingly but devastatingly when it was warranted. "You don't have to earn love, but you do have to show up for it." She'd said it to both of us at different times in our lives. "I miss her too," Daniel said, and his voice broke on the last word. And just like that, I was back in the kitchen on Christmas morning. 41 years of mornings collapsing into one, and my son was not 34 years old in Atlanta with a wife who looks past me at the dinner table. He was 7 years old in footy pajamas at the top of the stairs. Asking if Santa had come yet, I sat down. We talked for 2 hours, the longest we talked in years, maybe since his mother's funeral. He told me things I hadn't known, that the first year of his marriage had been harder than he let on, that Natalie had anxiety that was more serious than he'd been letting on, that she and I had gotten off on the wrong foot very early over something he'd never explained to me. Some comment she'd taken badly, and that had calcified into a whole architecture of distance. He wasn't making excuses. He was explaining. There's a difference. And I gave him credit for it. I told him things too, about being 63 and living 12 minutes away and eating reheated chili alone on December afternoons, about how often I thought about his mother and how I'd bought the Roswell house partly because of a fantasy I'd had, clear as anything, of watching grandchildren run around that yard, about how the recipe box was sitting on my kitchen shelf, and every time I saw it, I thought about the fact that he'd asked for it as a casual favor, like it was a hand tool he needed to borrow. He cried, "I think." I didn't comment on it. By the end of the call, I hadn't handed him anything back. The house was sold. The trust was changed. Those things were not reversible, and I hadn't offered to reverse them, and he hadn't asked. What we'd done instead was something harder and more necessary. We'd actually talked to each other for the first time in too long, without intermediaries, without the soft static of avoidance. Before we hung up, he said, "Can I come see you this weekend?" "Yes," I said. "Come Saturday. I'll make the chili. Just you and me." I thought about that. "Just you and me," I said. "For now." He came on Saturday. He brought good coffee and a tin of those butter cookies I used to keep in the house when he was growing up. The kind in the blue tin that everyone pretends is disappointing but finishes in a day. He sat at my kitchen table and we ate chili, and he asked me about my engineering projects. Really asked, not politely. And I asked him about his work, and he told me about a deal he was closing in Buckhead that he was genuinely excited about. At some point he noticed the recipe box on the shelf. He didn't ask for it. He looked at it for a moment and then looked at me and said, "Can you teach me how to make the stuffed cabbage?" "That's a 2-day project," I said. "I know, I have time." I pulled the box down and found the card. Carol's handwriting. That steady school teacher print she'd never lost, even when her hands had started to shake near the end. My son looked at it for a long time before he set it on the table between us. We started with the rice. I don't know what happens next with Natalie. That's a longer road, and I'm not naive about it. Some things that have calcified take a long time to soften, and some of them don't soften at all. But I know that my son drove over the Roswell property on his way to my place that Saturday. He told me so, mentioned it offhandedly, said the developer had already put up a fence along the property line. He'd been quiet for a minute after he said it. Then he'd said, "It would have been a good house for kids." "Yeah," I said. It would have. I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't say it's fine because it wasn't entirely fine, and we were past the stage of saying things that weren't true just to smooth things over. What I said was, I know you are. Let's not waste it. He nodded. He understood what that meant, or he's starting to. There are things that don't come back once they're gone. A house on 2 acres in Roswell. Years of Sunday phone calls. Christmases that already happened and won't happen again. You can't buy back the time you spent being managed by someone else's anxiety instead of showing up for the people who loved you first. But you can get up on a Saturday morning and drive to your father's place with good coffee and butter cookies. You can sit at the kitchen table and learn to make your grandmother's stuffed cabbage from a handwritten index card with notes in the margins. You can do the work of showing back up. That's what your mother would have wanted. And late, like most things worth doing, it still counts. I think about that Tuesday afternoon a lot. The radiator hissing, the chili going cold. My son's voice on the phone telling me, without quite saying it, that I had become an inconvenience. What strikes me now isn't the anger I didn't feel, or the sadness I did. It's how long I'd been making excuses before that call. How many small moments I had smoothed over in my own mind, the unreturned Sundays, the text about the recipe box, the way Natalie looked through me at the dinner table, because I didn't want to see what they added up to. That's not patience. That's avoidance, dressed up as grace. And I think a lot of us, especially those of us who've been fathers for a long time, confuse the two. Here's what I had to reckon with honestly. I had made it very easy for Daniel to take me for granted. Not because I was weak, but because I had never required anything of him in return for what I gave. I thought love meant giving without conditions. What I hadn't understood is that giving without any expectation of basic decency doesn't teach generosity. It teaches that the giver doesn't matter. I had spent years funding a version of my son's life in which I was, increasingly, a background figure. That was partly on me. And yet, the moment I stopped, the moment I made a clear decision about my own property and my own life without asking permission, something shifted. Not because money is what matters, but because action is honest in a way that resentment never is. I had been quietly hurt for 2 years. The sale of that house was the first truly honest thing I had done in response to how I felt. Daniel heard it immediately. You can tune out a father's silence for a long time. You cannot tune out consequences. What Daniel did, coming over that Saturday with coffee and butter cookies, sitting at my kitchen table, asking to learn his grandmother's recipe, that took something real. It would have been easier to stay away, to be defensive, to let Natalie's version of events become the permanent story, choosing to show up anyway, to say I don't know when I stopped calling on Sundays, and mean it. That required the kind of honesty that most people spend their whole lives avoiding. I was proud of him for it. I still am. I'm not a man who believes that things work out because the universe is keeping score. What I believe is simpler. How you treat people compounds over time, in both directions. The warmth you put out comes back around eventually, and so does the coldness. Daniel had spent 2 years letting distance compound. When he finally reversed course, genuinely, it compounded in the other direction too. That's not magic. That's just how human beings work when they're paying attention. If I could say one thing to anyone sitting where Daniel was sitting 2 years ago, quietly letting someone else's discomfort become the reason you disappear from people who love you, it would be this. The people who showed up for you before anyone else did are worth the discomfort of showing up for them now. That's not obligation. That's character. And character, unlike a house in Roswell, is something nobody can sell out from under you. We still make the stuffed cabbage every December. It takes 2 days and it's worth every minute.